Mankind's journey to colonize the stars is a story that stretches back over a millennium. Some 1,000 years prior, our ancestors in the 20th century were locked in a nuclear standoff between two superpowers. Each side searched for ways to gain the upper hand, leading them inexorably to look to the heavens. The space race saw humanity slip the surly bonds of Earth and take our first tentative steps towards the next phase in our evolution, what some poetically refer to as Homo Stellaris. History has taught us that whatever new frontiers people explore, we cannot help but bring our warlike nature with us. So it was with space. Under President Reagan, the United States of America launched Excalibur anti-missile satellites into orbit, forming the first link in the Strategic Defense Initiative. These laser batteries could strike at intercontinental ballistic missiles in flight, rendering the enormous nuclear stockpiles of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics ineffective. Some have argued that this advancement precipitated the collapse of the Soviet Union on January 11, 1988, ending the Cold War. The reformed Republic of Russia under Premier Gorbachev at first worked to de-escalate tensions with their NATO rivals, leading both sides to begin scaling back on their exorbitant defense budgets. Unfortunately, this thawing in the relationship between old enemies lasted only a few short years before a crippling recession brought on by Russia's failed transition to capitalism opened the door for a conservative communist faction to seize power in 1997, re-establishing the USSR and restarting the Cold War. Discourse within the United Nations spiraled downwards from there. In anticipation of future conflict, NATO and their allies Japan developed Krypin Station, a 1.5 kilometer long orbital command center that would far surpass the size and capabilities of its Soviet counterpart. The first components were launched in 2005, and within 2 years, Krypin had become the centerpiece of the rechristened Western Orbital Defense Network. By this time, the complete collapse of the Soviet Union's economy had shifted the political landscape considerably. In 2004, a more liberal Premier Tikhonov rose to power on a platform of repairing the USSR's dire economic situation by carefully opening its doors to the West. His efforts culminated in the signing of the landmark Tikhonov Accords on January 14, 2011, which would see the struggling nation receive financial aid from America. In a cruel twist of fate, just 4 hours after signing the historic document, the Premier and his family were assassinated by an extremist, plunging the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics into chaos. Regions that had long sought freedom from the regime were quick to take advantage. The Ukrainian People's Republic declared themselves independent on March 3rd, with Czechoslovakia and East Germany following their lead 2 weeks later. Poland tried to do the same, but the fracturing military ruthlessly stamped out the uprising. Admiral Tarantov of the KGB imposed martial law, hoping to prevent an outbreak of hostilities, but the Soviet Union's violent breakup was unavoidable. A bloody three-way civil war between the liberals, conservatives, and secessionists ensued, and the countries of the Warsaw Pact were engulfed in flames. By the end of 2013, the tide was turning against the old guard. Defeats at Leningrad, Minsk, and Moscow had robbed them of their strength, with worse to come in the new year. That January, President Giuliani ordered NATO to intervene. In Europe, ground troops moved to assist Czechoslovakia and Poland, while ships traversed the frozen Arctic waters to secure a beachhead on the Kola Peninsula. The Pacific Fleet anchored itself off Vladivostok, but this brought them into conflict with their ally Japan, a nation which was trying to assert its own dominance in the region. A brief engagement saw NATO emerge victorious, but their relationship with the Japanese people was perhaps irreparably tarnished. Another task force moved up the Baltic Sea, engaging the Soviet Navy off the coast of Latvia. This prompted a desperate nuclear retaliation from Soviet hardliners, launching an array of missiles at East and West Germany. Thankfully, Woden was able to intercept and destroy the warheads in flight, but this only prompted the last Soviet Army division to instead target those they could reach. The city of Riga, a stronghold of the liberal faction, was blanketed with chemical weapons, killing many hundreds of thousands. This abhorrent act of petty retribution shattered any remaining support the Old Guard had, and by March, the war had come to an end. Over 15 million had been killed. In the aftermath of this brutal conflict, Prime Minister Johnson of the United Kingdom advocated for a strengthening of the partnership between Western allies through the integration of the European Common Market and the Free Trade Zone of the Americas. Heads of state converged on Berlin to discuss this possibility. After months of deliberation, an agreement was reached, leading to the formation of the Western Alliance. Soviet leaders met at Kiev to discuss their own future. The USSR was divided up into 7 new states, but all concurred that closer ties to the West would be beneficial. The nascent alliance agreed to accept all 7 after a 10-year probationary period. The United States of America at first refrained from joining. They believed that the smaller, less affluent nations had been granted a disproportionate level of control in the new Geneva-based government, a concession that the USA criticized heavily. Nevertheless, the economic benefits could not long be ignored. They too joined in 2015. Soon after its formation, the Western Alliance began looking for a way to celebrate their historic union through the pursuit of scientific achievement. They would collaborate together to do what no one else had managed before: sending a man to Mars. The Alliance Space Command was formed in January 2016, and already by December had established a permanent headquarters on the lunar surface, with orbiting manufacturing facilities overhead. The ability to construct and launch spacecraft directly from the moon would allow any new design to bypass the costly fuel burn required to escape Earth's atmosphere, extending its range significantly. 4 ships were commissioned and built over the next 2 years, with the first ready to launch by July 2017. AS Altair and her 6-man crew departed for the Red Planet, with AS Procyon following on in August as support or rescue if needed. After a 6-month journey, the 2 craft arrived at Mars early in the new year, to much acclaim. Before the return voyage had even taken place, Krypton Station was launching other unmanned probes to explore the asteroid belt and Jovian moons. These successes inspired commercial interests to invest in their own scientific pursuits, hopeful that they would result in profitable advanced technologies. No field of study saw greater focus than the effort to create a functional fusion reactor. A collaborative effort between several universities, the California Research Design Team, worked together to solve some of the problems that had prevented any prior attempts from being able to generate more power than they had consumed in operation. Their efforts bore fruit in June 2018, at which point General Motors stepped in to fund further development. In 2020, their investments paid off when a team of scientists from Harvard and MIT became the first to achieve sustained net positive energy production from their reactor. This development could potentially solve the world's energy needs and catapult mankind towards new discoveries. GM patented the design the next year, with the first industrial fusion power plants following soon after. 1 month after the Californian think tank made its initial breakthrough on the technology, 2 scientists working at Stanford University observed an anomaly in the data that seemingly contradicted physics as they were then understood. These 2 individuals were Thomas Kearney and Takeyoshi Fuchida. They conjectured that the speed of light was not the hard limit it was believed to be, and that subatomic particles could, with enough energy, bypass it altogether by moving through hyperdimensional space. In late 2018, they published their hypothesis, but few took notice. There was no feasible way to harness the kind of power it would require to conduct the experiments they wanted to carry out, not without several further breakthroughs in fusion technology. 3 more increasingly far-fetched papers followed in successive years, but all they won for their efforts was the disdain and derision of their peers. The 2 nuclear engineers would ultimately retire from the field altogether. They and their research would fade into obscurity. The Western Alliance evolved quickly in its first few years. What initially was intended as a purely economic union soon became one of mutual defense. While the member states retained their individual militaries, NATO had been dissolved, and in its place rose the Western Alliance Armed Forces, a centralized command answering solely to the Geneva government. At the time of the fusion breakthrough, it had already far outstripped its predecessors in scope, incorporating the territories of not just the defunct NATO and Warsaw Pact, but more distant states as well. In 2019, India made the historic decision to enter into the coalition. This last act threatened to destabilize the delicate balance between nations in the early 21st century. With India to their southwest and the former USSR set to join the Western Alliance within the next few years, China was looking increasingly boxed in. In 2022, they, alongside the Hong Kong Collective and United Korea, formed a counterweight to what they saw as Western encroachment on their territory, in the form of the Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere. Relations between the two became increasingly hostile. They even threatened to seize control of the mining outposts in frozen Antarctica that were crippling the value of their mineral exports. In an effort to avoid a full encirclement, the ACPS aggressively lobbied Japan, the planet's 3rd largest economy, to join in their vision of Pan-Asianism. When support was not immediately forthcoming, radical elements of the Chinese government pushed for a complete blockade of the island nation. The dubious justification for this was to keep the Western Alliance armed forces out. Against better judgment, the operation went ahead in January 2023. It proved to be a major strategic blunder that backfired spectacularly. The United States of America transferred all of their military personnel stationed within Japan over to the WAAF. Beginning in April, these troops would assist in airlifting supplies over to the archipelago. Despite these efforts, the hardships brought on by the blockade led to food shortages, and the government's refusal to deploy the Japanese Defense Force and start a war led to their own downfall, necessitating the Imperial House to take emergency control of the realm. Relief convoys were dispatched from Pearl Harbor in May to ease the burden, but as soon as they approached the blockade, they were fired upon, forcing them to turn back. Subsequent efforts would receive a naval escort. Disaster struck when the Chinese cruiser Ironflower inadvertently collided with USS Bremerton and then opened fire on the stricken vessel. A pair of Japanese destroyers swiftly raced to intervene, but were themselves fired upon. In the ensuing engagement, Akagi, Bremerton, and Ironflower were all sunk, which collapsed any remaining support for the Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere among the Japanese people, and prompted swift retaliatory strikes by the JDF around Tokyo, clearing a passage for the relief convoys to reach them. Before the situation could escalate any further, Japanese diplomats invited their counterparts from both sides to a meeting on their neutral soil. Over the next year, they hammered out what would become known as the Osaka Agreement, which saw themselves, the Free Russian States, and the ACPS minus the Hong Kong Collective join the Western Alliance in 2024. This did not happen without concessions. China argued for greater autonomy in handling internal affairs and freedom to pursue their objectives in Southeast Asia. They found unexpected allies in the US and Japan as the three industrial giants pushed for the larger economies to have more influence at Geneva. This subtle shift in power in favor of the wealthiest nations created the first hairline fractures in what had until this point been a strongly united organization. The aftershocks of this would follow mankind centuries into the future. With all of Earth's major powers under one banner for the first time in human history, the Western Alliance channeled all of its economic might into increasingly ambitious research projects. In April 2026, tests were completed on the first fusion rocket. Of the 4 vessels built by the Alliance Space Command as part of their Mars expedition, the last had never left Krypton Station. The 8-year-old AS Columbia was retrofitted with this new technology and launched on October 12th the next year. The ability to burn towards their destination for the duration of the flight, or at least halfway there before they had to decelerate again, allowed for a reduction in travel time from 6 months down to just 14 days. With one of the main barriers to future exploration of the Sol system removed, the ASC started preparing for manned missions to other planets and moons, but more ambitious scientists were contemplating far grander voyages. In 2028, they presented in front of the Western Alliance Parliament and proposed the Magellan Project, a series of long-range probes that would travel to nearby stars in search of other habitable worlds. Science fever had a firm grip over the people of the early 21st century, and so this ambitious program was quickly approved. But not everyone agreed to this allocation of funds, as it promised very little in the way of returns. Nevertheless, construction of the star probes began the next year, with Magellan 1 set for launch from Krypton Station in 2030. Such vast distances necessitated much larger spacecraft than anything previously manufactured. The vessels were 300 meters long and carried 30,000 tons of fuel, half of which they would use to accelerate for 2 continuous months up to 0.68 of the speed of light, then the second half to slow down as they approached their target. Even still, it was a journey that would take decades to complete. In total, 10 probes were constructed, 8 of which were launched between 2030 and 34. For now, nothing could be done but wait, and so the Western Alliance turned back to their own solar system in search of new opportunities. In 2031, the United States funded an expedition to the asteroid belt with the goal of exploiting the enormous mineral reserves. Despite the hardships in reaching the belt and the inherent dangers and challenges of zero-G mining, the mineral deposits there were so abundant that they could potentially supply Earth industry for tens of thousands of years. Other European and American commercial operations followed, with the Belter capital established within the initial drilling site at Metis. Rare elements were soon flowing back to Earth in abundance, and they became the main source of more common metals too later in the 21st century. The most distant outpost for mankind was located on Saturn's moon Titan, where the Alliance Space Command set up a permanent science base on January 29, 2042. Anticipation was building as the Magellan program entered its deceleration phase. Magellan 2 and Magellan 3 were the first to reach their destinations, but unfortunately reported no viable worlds at either Alpha Centauri or Barnard's star, something which with a millennium of hindsight we can now say was premature. After 24 years in transit, Magellan 1 arrived at Tau Ceti, and to the great excitement of those back on Earth, discovered that the system's fourth planet was a verdant garden world. By the end of the decade, Magellan 4 and Magellan 5 also beamed back promising results from Epsilon Eridani and Indi. Actually setting foot on these worlds was going to be a completely different challenge, one that seemed beyond the reach of mankind without further advances in technology. The Western Alliance decreed that so-called slowboat colony ships were far too risky, as they had zero means to support such a venture should the crew come to harm. What they didn't know is that Magellan 6 had already been co-opted by fringe elements within the United States of America, and actually had a small contingent of stowaways on board. They sabotaged the probe so as to not send any updates back to Earth. Against all odds, they survived in isolation for decades, and upon reaching their destination in 2119, founded a tiny colony among the asteroid belt which they christened Columbia. It would be centuries before contact with the rest of mankind was re-established. The Western Alliance funded a follow-up to Magellan in the form of the Champlain program, but this was more limited in scope. The last of the 3 probes was launched in 2066, but none were successful. The reason for the smaller project was because the wealth inequality between member states was only increasing, and the poorer nations argued strongly against what they perceived as a pointless money sink. More tangible scientific advancements of the 21st century had come in the eradication of many diseases, advancements in metallurgy, and a reduction in pollution through widespread adoption of nuclear power. By the late 2070s, advances in fusion technology allowed newer reactors, only a tenth of the size of their earlier predecessors, to be powered off common hydrogen as opposed to heavier isotopes. But for those outside of the Western Alliance, this was not the golden age that others talked about. Though the major powers were able to cooperate, between 2034 and 2077, 2 horrific genocidal wars rocked Africa, with another in Indonesia, resulting in the deaths of some 11 million people. By the 2080s, 80% of the planet's 9 billion population live within the borders of the Western Alliance. Though the quality of life had soared over the past few decades, the rampant strong-arming by the old powers within Parliament pushed the others away. Much of the remainder of the populace lived in poverty, with one of the only notable exceptions being the wealthy Hong Kong Free State. For many years, it had been obvious that the name Western Alliance was wildly outdated and did not reflect the pan-national coalition it had grown into, with more than 120 nations from across the globe participating. In 2086, they took the historic step to rename the organization to better reflect its position as the first true world government. Henceforth, it would be known as the Terran Alliance. As grand a gesture as it was, this fresh coat of paint did nothing to resolve the underlying issues. The disparity between haves and have-nots had only increased. The individual countries that comprised the Terran Alliance looked out mainly for their own interests, with the European and North American nations ensuring they remained at the top of the pyramid. While secession was an option open to anyone, doing so would result in immediate trade embargoes. There were other countries that might have benefited from joining the Terran Alliance, but could simply not afford the membership. By 2089, a serious economic dislocation was enveloping much of the Third World. In 2096, the simmering tension permeating the Terran Alliance began to boil over, with a series of violent clashes across Latin America. Things reached a crescendo in July 2098, when Brazilian factory workers went on strike, leading to widespread protests that were beyond the abilities of local police to deal with. To quell the unrest, President Patrones called in the Terran Alliance armed forces for assistance. They dispatched a pair of divisions commanded by Leonard McKenna, distant ancestor to one of the most influential people in history. In a shocking act of barbarity, his troops opened fire on a crowd of at least 80,000, and some accounts claim almost a complete slaughter ensued. Though the situation was contained, occasional bursts of sedition and even terrorism would become a common fixture of the era. Despite the dangers, some people looking for an escape from what they perceived as the tyranny of the Terran Alliance began privately funding their own slowboat colony ships. Between 2082 and 2099, 9 separate vessels boosted out of the solar system, variously heading towards habitable planets identified by the Magellan program, or more remote stars hoping to reduce the chances that they might be followed. At the beginning of the 22nd century, the buried research of Drs. Thomas Kearney and Takeyoshi Fushida was rediscovered, beginning a race to become the first team to verify the existence of what was known as Kearney-Fushida pan-dimensional gravitational mathematics. Several universities around the globe took up the challenge, using the latest fusion reactors to conduct the experiments. On May 25, 2102, the universities of Auckland and Ottawa announced near-simultaneous breakthroughs, with Cambridge and the Czech Technical University hot on their heels. If scaled up, this new innovation could allow for a larger object to travel near instantaneously, jumping through hyperspace from one location to another. The Terran Alliance Science Council wasted no time in presenting these findings at Geneva that September. With government funding, they could undertake an extrasolar space mission, traveling to those distant garden worlds discovered by the Magellan program. The cost of this venture, 1 trillion credits. The response was a mixture of excitement and outrage depending on an individual country's GDP. After the restructuring of 2086, contributions towards scientific pursuits directly correlated to the size of one's population, meaning the greater burden was shouldered by the poorer nations. Despite this, in November 2103, after 14 months of intense debate, the Alliance World Parliament voted to fund the experiment, but only with a narrow majority of 3 votes. Work began at Mars's second moon, giving the endeavour its name, the Deimos Project. The undertaking quickly swallowed up vast amounts of money, over 400 billion credits in its first year alone. By 2105, the budget was already receiving its 5th increase, pushing many to their breaking points. On April 2nd, food riots broke out in Northern Ireland, and by July, the rioting had spread to several cities across Africa and Latin America. Within 4 months, those regions had erupted into violence. The Terran Alliance armed forces moved aggressively to quell the unrest. The Deimos tax rebellion would result in more than 3 million casualties, among them 70,000 TAAF soldiers. This heavy-handed response kicked off a wave of secessionist movements. By April 2106, 12 nations had split from the Terran Alliance, more than a dozen others following them out the door over the next year. Within Parliament, the Alliance of Poorer Nations, championed by the representative from Brazil, refused to make any further contributions to the project until the other states agreed to divide up the cost as a straight percentage of GDP, which ultimately they were forced to agree to. After several years of hardship, in 2107, the prototype Deimos hyperdrive was completed. Measuring approximately 200 meters in length, it was little more than a framework around an extraordinarily complex titanium-germanium core, with a navigational computer bolted to the front of it. On August 28th, the device was towed into position at a distance of 7 AU above Sol, the system's zenith. Its pre-programmed destination was its opposite location below Earth's sun, Sol's nadir. The reason for this distance was because it was discovered that tidal forces created by a star or planet could tear a vessel apart if it was too deep inside the gravity well when it jumped. The needle-like vessel was charged by the flagship Volga, and at midnight on September 3rd, the Go command was transmitted. The ship vanished before the eyes of the project leads. It would take 2 long hours for a transmission traveling at the speed of light sent by their colleagues to reach them, confirming that the hyperdrive had rematerialized at the other end within a minute of departing. In deference to the scientists who had first theorized such a feat was possible, the device was renamed the Kearney Fuchida drive. The success of this operation at the first time of asking quietened protests among the Terran Alliance, but they flared up again when hundreds of billions of credits and additional funding was allocated to the Deimos project, with the new goal of reaching the best-known planet fit for habitation at Tau Ceti. The scientists had learned a lot from the initial experiment, but weren't quite ready to launch a manned mission just yet. That the test vessel had re-emerged at all was a minor miracle, as they discovered that the actual safe jump distance for Sol lay at just over 10 AU, perhaps accounting for the unexpected delay as it passed through hyperspace. Further experimental jumps were carried out over the next few months, several with animals on board to confirm whether such a journey was survivable. All of them came back positive. In February 2108, the Deimos project achieved another landmark success, when Raymond Bash became the first human to travel by means of KF drive, reporting only mild dizziness and nausea. Several others made their own jumps over the next few months, with none exhibiting any serious medical concerns. Work on TAS Pathfinder, humanity's first interstellar spacecraft, was completed that November. It had a maximum jump distance of 15 light-years, giving it sufficient range to reach the Tau Ceti system. Far from the needle-like prototype, this was a true exploration vessel, with a crew of 14 and transit drives to carry it the final leg of the journey from the jump point to orbit over the 4th planet. Command of this historic mission fell to Captain Norm McKenna, another in the illustrious family line that would shape the future of the Terran Alliance. On December 5th, 2108, he and his crew jumped out of the system. For 30 nerve-wracking days, mankind collectively held its breath as people awaited their return. They had no way of knowing whether the ship had survived the journey. Similarly, if both fusion reactors on board malfunctioned, the crew would have no way of recharging their KF drive in order to make the voyage back. On January 4th, 2109, TAS Pathfinder rematerialized precisely on schedule, with confirmation that they had traveled to another star. And the world celebrated. No technological breakthrough impacted the course of 22nd century history to the same extent that the Kearney Fuchida drive did. It propelled mankind to new frontiers, allowing us to explore distant solar systems and search for habitable planets to settle. First to experience this new freedom was the crew of TAS Pathfinder. After materializing at the Tau Ceti jump point, Norm McKenna took the ship in system, surveying the alien worlds as they passed. On December 15th, 2108, research teams descended onto Tau Ceti 4 and found conditions to be better suited for human physiology than their wildest dreams. The crew thus dubbed the planet New Earth, a name it still retains to this day despite the gradual transition towards referring to humanity's homeworld as Terra. Michelle Land etched her name in the history books when she became the first person to set foot on an extrasolar object. Various local samples and wildlife were taken, but so too was one of the survey drones detached from Magellan 1 half a century earlier. Upon their return home, Each member of the crew was treated like celebrities. The success of TAS Pathfinder in traveling to another world helped to quell unrest on Earth, but the Terran Alliance seemingly could not resist fanning the flames. In short order, they announced plans to establish a permanent colony on New Earth. Over ardent protests, in May 2109, construction began on a number of new vessels, the first of which, TAS Ark, was due to be completed in 5 years' time. McKenna and his crew, meanwhile, continued their journey through space. Over the next year, TAS Pathfinder travelled to 35 other star systems within a 40 light-year radius of Sol, and found several other marginally habitable worlds, though none that could match New Earth. In February 2110, the venerable ship made its last voyage back to Tau Ceti with 35 souls on board. Together, they established the first research outpost on an alien world. While the Deimos project was looking to other stars, the Alliance World Parliament was not neglecting the Terran system. Over the past century, dozens of minor outposts had sprung up on various planets, moons, and asteroids, but none of these could be considered a true colony, as their population was almost entirely transitory. What's more, if mankind was to settle other star systems, they would need experience altering the environment to better suit human biology. Thus, the Department of Mega Engineering was created, with its first mandate to terraform Mars. Project Lowell was launched in 2110, a multi-generational undertaking that aimed to produce a breathable atmosphere by the 23rd century. First, comets were deorbited using the Phobos skyhook and launched at the world to add water ice and other greenhouse gases, while asteroids were towed into proximity and mined for materials used to construct 2 gigantic orbital mirrors, which would gradually increase surface temperatures. Once the asteroids were hollowed out, they were crashed into the surface, the kinetic energy of hundreds of such collisions further raising the temperature. Dome then seeded the red planet with blue-green algae, which would slowly alter the makeup of the thin Martian air. After a series of delays, each one adding to the price tag, TAS Ark made its maiden voyage on March 8, 2116, carrying almost 500 colonists to Tau Ceti. Every passenger was carefully vetted for skills and health complications before beginning the journey, but what wasn't made public is that 10% of those individuals had been volunteered by the Alliance Special Security Council, effectively becoming slave labor. Control of this colony fell to a Terran Alliance-appointed governor, setting a dangerous precedent for anyone looking to escape the overbearing world government. With an ever-increasing number of people heading into space, both near and far, concerns started to grow about the possibility of an attack on one of these sites. In 2120, the Alliance World Parliament formed the Terran Space Navy, ostensibly as a means to ensure the safety of these far-flung outposts, commissioning 6 new vessels to outfit their fleet over the next decade. In truth, the TSN served as a means for the government to project their power into space, and to ensure they got what they felt was owed. TAS Charger was launched in 2122, becoming the first ship equipped with a Kearney Fushida drive to carry weapons. This came not a moment too soon. By 2123, expanded mining operations within the asteroid belt and further development in KF technology brought the cost of constructing a jump drive down to levels where individual nations or megacorporations could consider financing their own interstellar transports. These early pioneers represented little more than a trickle compared to the flood that would follow later, but it nonetheless began the period we now refer to as the First Exodus. The Nippon Confederation, United States of America, and United States of Europe were the first to build their own colony ships. By getting in on the action ahead of their peers, it gave those countries freedom to pick the most promising sites for themselves. Once the less affluent regions were able to fund their own expeditions, they had to be content with second-class worlds or longer journeys to equivalents further out. This created a feedback loop where the rich got richer and the poor fell further behind. Even centuries later, long after those old nation-states have ceased to exist, human space is still dominated by people descended from those regions. Unfortunately, with so many thousands departing for uncharted stars, it was only a matter of time until misfortune befell one of those expeditions. On April 26, 2128, the Bolivar Foundation vessel Liberator was preparing to make its initial jump. The drive discharged as planned, the vessel vanished from sight, and was never seen or heard from again. Liberator became the first ship to experience what was known as a misjump, a malfunction which can lead to the complete destruction of a craft. This disaster led some eccentrics to speculate that hyperspace was not the empty void they envisioned, but rather one populated with transdimensional beings inhabiting the warp between reality that would snatch any vessel passing through their chaotic domain. In the wake of this tragedy, the Terran Alliance put a stop to what they perceived as a wave of dissidents fleeing to parts unknown. On May 25th, barely a month after the accident, the Colonization Procedure Referendum narrowly passed through Parliament, imposing a slew of new controls and checks on future expansion. Only authorized individuals would be allowed to book passage out of the solar system. All colony ships must be escorted to their destination by an armed vessel of the TSN. Any new colony was to be administered by an appointed governor and fell under the sole authority of the Terran Alliance Foreign Ministry. In short, no matter where you went, no matter what you found, it belonged to the Alliance. Despite the restrictions imposed on them, those individuals with a sense of adventure that only journeying to the stars could quench were not deterred from pursuing their dream. Initially, there was much excitement about the number of planets that lay within the so-called Goldilocks zone of their local sun, but this gradually faded as prospective colonists discovered that the true scarcity lay in how few worlds possessed potable water. Purification systems of the size needed to support permanent habitation were large, heavy, expensive, and required regular maintenance, all things which made them impractical. Yet attempting to do without them had already resulted in the deaths of a handful of fledgling colonies to contaminated water. This limited early expansion to just a few dozen perfect worlds. Nevertheless, construction of KF drive-equipped spacecraft only increased during this period, with Boeing Interstellar launching the Aquila-class transport in 2148 as the first mass-produced vessel of its type. As an aside, beginning in the 2140s, 3 of the slowboat colonies that had left in the latter years of the 21st century began arriving at the viable worlds identified by the Magellan program, only to discover that they had already been colonized. Of the others that had survived the voyage out to less hospitable systems, it would take another 200 years before they re-established contact, and the Magellan 6 stowaways would remain undiscovered for hundreds of years even beyond that. The next step in terraforming Mars began in 2151, with the introduction of more complex lifeforms to the surface. By 2160, the Red Planet was home to a modest population of 15,000 people, with a few thousand more in orbit aboard the newly constructed Martian orbital habitat. With near unlimited funds to draw upon, the Department of Mega Engineering's Project Lowell was proceeding well, though the inhabitants were still required to wear environmental suits and rebreathers if venturing outside. A vast number of atmospheric processors were installed as the final stage, with the project concluding ahead of schedule in the final decade of the 22nd century. It remains one of the most significant alterations mankind has ever made to a planet's environment, second only to Dome's next undertaking. As the Terran Alliance expanded outwards, it became increasingly difficult to keep tabs on the most distant colonies. early KF drives were limited to just 15 light-years in range. Recharging was a process that took weeks and consumed most of their fuel. Some of the better established systems had tankers waiting at the jump points, but at more fringe outposts, a ship might have to navigate in-system to refuel before returning back to a safe distance from which they could then proceed onwards. By 2168, transiting from one end of settled space to the other took approximately 3 months. That year, the Alliance World Parliament undertook a grand survey, a process that would take 4 years to complete. The public reason for this census was to update records and satisfy curiosity, but there was an undercurrent of Big Brother keeping an eye on things. Most colonists saw it for what it was, a show of force. They published their findings in August 2172. Mankind had now spread to 108 worlds within a 60 light-year radius of Terra. With centuries of hindsight, we can see now that this figure was a significant underestimate. Humanity had already reached planets more than twice that distance from its homeworld. The nature of that word was also changing, as the first generations born in the earliest colonies grew up with no strong attachment to their species' planet of origin. 2177 saw the formation of the Lyran cartel. The company's founder had just made a technological breakthrough that would allow a fleet of 16 ships to jump in tandem between systems. Like a complex three-dimensional Venn diagram, an area of space suspended between them would also be carried through hyperspace to their destination. Others had dismissed this possibility as having no practical purpose, as whatever object was in that zone would be torn apart by competing gravitational pulls from the individual vessels. As such, Ryan was able to patent his technique, a decision that would soon make him one of the wealthiest individuals of the era. He saw the potential for taking water-ice comets from systems with no habitable worlds and moving them in large chunks 2 kilometers across to planets that could benefit from clean, pure water. Shuttles would then transport the water ice down to the surface, whereupon airships would distribute it from the spaceports to the outlying towns. The Lyran cartel allowed for a range of planets that had previously been written off to become viable destinations, opening the floodgates to new colonization efforts. Ryan was doing far more than just providing water though. He was actually operating an underground railroad for people looking to flee the oppressive regime back on Earth. It wasn't uncommon for one of his ships to go missing, written off in the books as a misjump, but actually carrying hundreds of people out into distant space. All this alarmed the Terran Alliance considerably. The cost of reaching and sustaining an off-world settlement was coming down, while the challenge of monitoring just the existing colonies was already pushing the Terran Space Navy to the limit. Their authority could become seriously undermined if some of Earth's non-member countries banded together into a new power bloc and began launching their own colony ships. However remote the possibility that a rival star empire might emerge was, Geneva decided to take action to nip such an eventuality in the bud. One fanciful solution proposed as a counter to any potential threat posed by belligerent off-world colonies was the creation of dedicated warships for the interception and destruction of enemy vessels, and even the bombardment of hostile planets if the situation called for it. These new superweapons would be outfitted primarily with capital-class missiles, the best delivery option for the more than 100 nuclear warheads carried on board. The designs would never make it off the drawing board, however, due to the ludicrous costs involved. Whenever a country decided to secede from the Alliance, they were invariably branded as separatists by those who remained, a term which soon expanded to encompass anyone who was not part of the organization. Rhetoric turned different to dangerous, and the Terran Alliance armed forces deployed to bring all of Earth under one banner for good. Fighting broke out all across the Third World as they struggled to maintain their independence. In 2179, the Hong Kong Free State, one of the few islands of stability outside of the alliance, was overrun by the Chinese Republic. Pacifying the final holdouts took years, but there was never any doubt as to who would come out on top. Their victory proved to be a poison pill for the Terran alliance. All those dissidents they had driven out were now living within their borders. Waves of violence swept over previously peaceful regions as conquered people expressed their discontent. Perhaps the most infamous group to come out of this period was known as the New World Disciples. This small band of radicals went straight for the jugular. In 2182, they began a 6-year campaign of terror that resulted in the deaths of 26 heads of state, 14 Alliance Parliament representatives, and 135 other individuals. Another victim to fall foul of these troubled times was Rudolf Ryan, killed by an anarchist assassin in 2185. The threat posed by the New World Disciples was only eliminated after their headquarters was traced to Nepal, after which the TAAF launched a mass assault to eradicate them for good. The attacks against the Geneva officials, which specifically targeted politicians and civil servants from the ruling party, gave the impetus and justification for a greater expansion in the Alliance World Parliament's transnational power. In the name of putting an end to the systemic terror attacks that plagued them, their agents were permitted to freely cross borders to pursue the extremists wherever they bolted. When caught, they would impose their own laws, bypassing whatever regional authority might have existed. But as an organization that was originally envisioned as simply a trade partnership, the Terran Alliance lacked a constitution that might protect the individual rights and liberties of the accused. Harsh justice was meted out, with many of those arrested disappearing altogether. The transformation of what had once been an idealistic, science-driven union of cooperation into an authoritarian police state was nearly complete. As the Terran Alliance neared the 23rd century, it was fast approaching the end of its life cycle. Its formation could be likened to that of a star, sending out the light of mankind to settle distant space, but pulling in all of the materials and resources within its reach to feed an insatiable fire. At first, it had swelled in size, but imposing their beliefs and control onto an ever greater number of colonies had burned through the last of Earth's energy, and soon, the pressure pushing back from the outer reaches would overcome it. When that happened, stellar collapse would follow. The Terran Alliance wasn't quite yet the monolithic superstate that it's often remembered as. In many ways, the manner in which it had grown in power allowed it to remain separate from the old Earth countries, rather than above them. Its bureaucrats and policymakers answered only to themselves, but the more powerful member nations still retained a high degree of autonomy. This was particularly true in military strength, where the individual states retained the lion's share of the planet's weapons, though these forces began to atrophy in the wake of the wars that brought the remaining separatists kicking and screaming into the Union. Around this time, the Terran Alliance armed forces received a rebranding, henceforth known as the Alliance Global Militia. As the crackdown on anti-government factions continued, those people attempted to use what connections they still had to smuggle themselves off-world. Terra was no longer a safe place to be for anyone who refused to conform. Many of those who could not afford to book passage out of the system ended up settling in the asteroid belt, Trojans, or even the distant Kuiper belt. There is arguably no more fiercely independent group of people alive today than the reclusive Belters, a legacy of their refugee ancestors. Geneva did its best to track the movement of those fleeing Earth, but the task was almost impossible. The core systems were well established by this point and firmly in the pocket of the Alliance, driving this latest wave of colonists to settle within the frontier outer reaches. In 2195, a second grand survey was completed, this one reporting 204 worlds within 85 light-years. But again, this didn't accurately reflect the true extent of human expansion. Anticipating that the Alliance Navy would continue to pursue them despite the challenges, the rebels prepared for future confrontations. They received aid from the heir to the Ryan cartel, whose ice ships spent nearly as much time smuggling arms out to the colonies as they did delivering water. In the last decade of the 22nd century, the Department of Mega Engineering began Project Aphrodite, the terraforming of Venus. This was at the time the most ambitious venture mankind had ever undertaken, and arguably still is to this day. Somewhat amusingly, the terraforming of Venus began on Mercury, where uncountable tons of calcium were extracted from the crust to feed the production of atmosphere-altering blue-green algae. Comets were again looked at as a means of introducing new elements to the planet, but deemed insufficient. Instead, Aphrodite turned to Titan to supply them with the required hydrogen gas, in turn fueling the development of Saturn's moon. The first stage of this endeavour was to build living space for the workers. The surface was far too hot to live on, so instead they fabricated numerous space factories alongside the Venusian orbital habitat. Though these were of significant size, they were minuscule compared to what followed. A colossal orbital shade, thousands of kilometers wide, the largest object ever assembled in human history. Positioned at a Lagrange point partway between Venus and the Sun, this created a permanent partial eclipse above the planet, the first stage in lowering the 460-degree surface temperature. The starlight side of this sun umbrella was covered in immense solar panels, the energy of which would be more than sufficient to power any future colony, but in the meantime was beamed out to the asteroid belt as a means of reducing rocks to slag. Throughout its existence, the parliamentary representatives of the Terran Alliance, and even its predecessor the Western Alliance, were appointed by a country's head of state. There was no democratic process to determine who would sit in that chair. As such, most of the world's population remained politically apathetic towards the institution. The position was deemed best suited to relatively junior politicians, who might later graduate to more important roles at home or as foreign ambassadors. But as the organization grew in power, they found themselves wielding ever greater authority without having to answer to an electorate. In theory, a country could appoint a different representative at any time, and so their actions were kept in check by another government body, typically a democratic one. But such actions risked being perceived as interfering with the Alliance's affairs. The first political parties at the Geneva Parliament began to emerge not long after space colonization began. Throughout the 22nd century, political discourse had been dominated by the so-called Expansionist Party, who advocated for continued growth and domination over off-world settlements. Their counterpart was the Liberal Party, but they were never more than the largest minority. Despite claiming to be more progressive, their beliefs were no less extreme. They were not so much interested in offering the colonies their freedom as they were telling them to get lost and not to bother Terra anymore. The early 23rd century was a turning point in Earth's history, as the old nations, even the most powerful among them, became subservient to the world government. From 2207, Geneva alone dictated how much money a country would have to contribute to retain representation in Parliament. By this point, the Alliance bureaucrats had mostly supplanted their counterparts at home, achieving dominance over their old masters. Some would argue it was a more symbiotic relationship, with those holding the true power allowing Parliament ever greater freedoms in exchange for support they would use to increase their popularity among the voting populace. Further advancements in Kearney-Fushida technology around the turn of the century allowed for jumps of up to 30 light-years in distance. This development came more or less at the same time as another, the invention of jump sails. Rather than rely on a ship's fusion reactor to recharge the hyperdrive, vessels could now deploy an enormous solar kite made from a material that absorbed the energy emitted by a star. This gave colony ships functionally unlimited range, or at least as far as their food and water supplies would take them. Early examples were an astonishing 50 kilometers in diameter, but later refinements brought this down to under 2,000 meters. These improvements only accelerated the outward expansion of humanity. The next two grand surveys highlighted just how quickly things were getting beyond the control of Earth to manage. In 2219, there were 316 colony worlds within 120 light-years, and just 16 years later, that number had soared to 628 inside a 250 light-year radius. This was the Terran Alliance at its absolute apex. For the past 150 years, it had gorged itself on the fruits of the off-world colonies, becoming ever more bloated and dysfunctional over time. The following year, Parliament's mismanagement would finally catch up with it. Of those 600 plus planets, less than 10% would take their side in the coming conflict. After 40 years of cooling, Venus's surface temperature had reached a milder 30 degrees Celsius, allowing for the next stage of the terraforming process to begin. Several hundred skyscraper-sized atmospheric processors had been constructed over the past 4 decades, and these were now lowered down to the surface to begin their work. Over time, they cleaned up the air and halted the toxic acid rain. While this process was ongoing, human habitation moved from space to the clouds, where thousands lived among huge floating cities. There, they could enjoy more tolerable living conditions than in orbit, but still above the thick, soupy atmosphere below. The air itself would become the fuel for the final stage of Dome's undertaking. Colossal fusion rockets burned around the clock for years on end to shorten the planet's 8-month rotational period down to a more bearable 48 hours. Project Aphrodite concluded in the mid-2200s, barely half a century after it had begun. Faster than anyone had dared to imagine, Venus had been transformed and was now able to support life. The surface was covered in nitrogen-rich chemicals, which when paired with artificial soil, acted as fantastic fertilizers for agriculture. In time, Venus would become the breadbasket of the Terran Alliance, developing the largest population of any planet within the solar system save Earth itself. On May 25, 2235, the house of cards that was the Terran Alliance's dominion over so many stars finally collapsed. President DuPont declared the planet Freedom's independence, and as word spread, several other systems followed their lead. Because of the distances involved, it took 8 months for their proclamation to make its way back to Terra. It did not come as a surprise. Conflict had in fact been anticipated for some time. There is some debate among historians about which was the first planet to secede, with opinions split evenly between Denebola and Freedom. Our best records suggest that the former did so later in 2235, without knowledge of events elsewhere. On account of its proximity to Earth, their declaration of independence reached Geneva first, but Denebola at the time was a tiny colony of little importance, and was not perceived as a credible challenge. While the government debated what action to take, two high-ranking officers of the Alliance Global Militia took it upon themselves to make the decision on their behalf. At the time Freedom's missive arrived in January 2236, the 2nd Interstellar Strategic Combined Assault Force had been on maneuvers around Saturn. They were primed for an immediate response, or as immediate as any action can be with months of travel time involved. Unbeknownst to the Alliance World Parliament, the Interstratcaf jumped out of the Sol system within days, tasked with bringing the rebel groups to heel. Most believed that this would take a mere 18 weeks. The general who gave the order later insisted that there was an understanding that the Alliance Global Militia would use intimidation only, as firing even a single shot could incite widespread rebellion. The initial group of secessionists lay primarily in a forward direction from Earth. The complicated reality of sending messages between planets meant that most of the outer reaches remained in the dark as to what was happening. Ironically, the first time many heard of the rebellion was when the Alliance governors suddenly ordered them to contribute troops and supplies to assist in the effort to crush the renegade worlds. Had the colonial marines not already been dispatched, the response to these calls might have dissuaded any further action. All across space, colonies refused the demands, leaving the AGM in the lurch. The reinforcements they believed were following up behind them would not be coming. The bloody ambush that was sprung upon their arrival at the target jump points heralded the viciousness that would go on to define the Outer Reaches rebellion. Both Zenith and Nadir had been extensively mined. Small vessels packed with explosives launched themselves at the materializing strike cruisers, assault carriers, and attack transports before they could accelerate. These suicidal tactics resulted in the deaths of 10% of the task force before anyone made landfall. Once the colonial marines did touch down, they did so with a vengeance. There are countless stories of Terran soldiers reveling in the carnage as they laid waste to entire communities. One of the worst incidents took place on Summit, where over 4 months, more than 10,000 civilians were massacred by the 23rd Alliance strikers. Similar carnage was unleashed by the 14th and 29th Alliance Special Combat Battalions when they attacked the University of Thebes on Alexandria. The planetary militia attempted to fight them off, but suffered 3,000 casualties over 4 months in the effort. The epicenter of the rebellion, Jefferson City on Freedom, was always going to be one of the hotspots of the conflict. 1,500 people were garrisoned within defensive structures the planet had spent years constructing in expectation of an armed conflict. Outside were the 4th Paracavalry Division, approximately 6,000 soldiers of the Alliance Global Militia. The initial assault on June 15th had ended in disaster, when President DuPont had infiltrated their lines and managed to capture a number of mobile artillery platforms. In an act of barbarity, the Marine General ordered the dead colonists to be loaded onto aircraft and dropped over the city as a means of crushing the enemy's morale. On August 25th, the Alliance strikers arrived from Summit, and that night the combined forces pushed into the city. 12 hours of slaughter claimed the lives of all but 70 colonists, but the price they paid was equally high, some 2,000 Marines dying in the effort. Despite the cost, the Terran Alliance has succeeded in winning the opening battles of the war. Unfortunately for them, the Outer Reaches rebellion was only just beginning. DuPont and his few dozen survivors took to the hills and began a guerrilla campaign. Similar resistance movements sprung up on every world the AGM landed on. Without the support they had been counting on from supposedly loyal colonies, the Alliance was forced to turn to third parties in order to supply both themselves and the conquered populations with the food and water they relied upon. The neutral Ryan cartel was able to secure permission to continue trading, but like his father before him, Ryan was secretly a firm supporter of colonial independence. By carrying word of the bloodbaths to other neighbouring systems, dozens more seceded from the Terran Alliance over the next few months. Rebel leaders were able to communicate by stowing away aboard the ice ships. Their ability to coordinate actions between themselves quickly surpassed the thinly stretched Alliance Navy. By the end of the first year, the rebellion had spread to more than 50 worlds, with no end in sight. The AGM had been revealed as the paper tiger it was, encouraging further revolution across Alliance space. On Terra itself, the Liberal Party received newfound support and used their expanded influence to block additional funding for the campaign. This in turn forced the expansionists to impose harsher quotas on their off-world holdings to make up the deficit, a cycle which led to an ever greater number of colonies declaring their independence. The writing was on the wall for the Terran Alliance's efforts to retain control over the outer reaches. Over 250,000 men and women had been deployed to the colonies, but 3 times as many had taken up arms against them. 18 months on, hundreds of thousands lay dead. In July 2237, 90% of the colonial marines were recalled back to the interior worlds, without any official acknowledgement or public statement. A ceasefire was never declared. Terra had simply lost interest in continuing the fight, and swept the whole sordid business under the rug. Just as predicted, the operation was doomed from the start. Now the question on everyone's lips was whether this defeat would bring down the entire Terran Alliance. In the wake of the disastrous Outer Reaches rebellion, the Terran Alliance's Liberal Party rose to become the dominant power at Geneva for the first time since their inception. The rival expansionists could have retained their existing seats until 2240, but their defeat was so absolute that they were functionally ousted from power. Most party heads stepped down. The Alliance Global Militia's inability to restore order saw humanity's distant colonies gain their de facto independence. While the Liberals had opposed military intervention against the rebel worlds, they were certainly no friends to the secessionists. In many ways, their beliefs were even more extreme than their peers who had led them into war. There was a lot of injured pride on Earth in the aftermath of such an embarrassing failure. Nobody wanted to acknowledge what had taken place out on the fringes of settled space. Perhaps for this reason, the Liberals instituted a series of oppressive laws that they hoped would put the matter to bed. Under their watch, all future off-world travel was suspended. Furthermore, any discussion of the Outer Reaches Rebellion was made illegal. Those who spoke out against these authoritarian laws found their assets seized and their bank accounts emptied. Such blatant financial manipulation caused the value of the credits to plummet. Until this point, the average Terran had been little affected by the distant unrest. Not so anymore. The Liberal Party's most infamous act came in 2242 when they issued the Demarcation Declaration. Effective immediately, the Terran Alliance relinquished control of all systems beyond a single jump from Earth. Henceforth, the colonies would have to fend for themselves. Naturally, this move was disastrous for the least developed worlds who were still dependent on aid shipments to survive. Many had been unhappy with Terran rule, but the Demarcation Declaration was tantamount to a death sentence for tens of thousands of colonists. This extreme action brought just as much chaos to humanity's homeworld. Nations were cut off from their extrasolar holdings, furthering the economic collapse. Rich and poor were affected equally. Wealthier states may have had a stronger domestic economy, but those industries were more reliant on an uninterrupted flow of resources arriving back on Earth. Many were simply outraged that the people they still perceived as their countrymen had been readily abandoned. As word filtered back that entire colonies had starved to death, rioting broke out across the planet. In short order, the Liberals themselves would become victims of their own mismanagement, losing their majority in Parliament that same year. The Expansionist Party was left to pick up the pieces, but there was no reversing the Demarcation Declaration. For the first time in its history, the Terran Alliance had a definitive border in space. A mere 20 systems still remained loyal to their roots, those core worlds being just 22 light-years away on average. Now that the Expansionists were back in power, they sought to silence their detractors. Controls were imposed on those professions that most often criticized the government, limiting how much they could work and what was deemed acceptable conduct. Black uniformed artist administrators would pay a visit to anyone who persisted in their behavior. Over time, the definition of artist expanded to include other occupations such as lawyers and physicians, any line of work that claimed to foster so-called freethinkers. In 2247, the Expansionist Party changed tack. Throughout the first century of jump travel, the Terran Alliance had attempted to limit how many of its perceived enemies were heading out into space. Now, Parliament adopted the opposite approach. They encouraged those undesirables to leave, perhaps hoping that it would secure their grasp on the reins of power. This change in policy began the Second Exodus. A significant brain drain ensued as humanity's best and brightest departed for regions of space where they were no longer oppressed, leading to a stagnation of technology both on Earth, where they lacked the freedom to pursue such ventures, and in the colonies, where a person's time was most often consumed with just trying to stay alive. When the Liberals came to power again in 2252, they went from encouraging their political rivals to emigrate off-world, to actively assisting in finding them a berth aboard an outbound transport. Revisiting our star analogy from earlier in this history, this was akin to a supernova that follows stellar collapse. Over the course of the Second Exodus, millions of Terrans would end up leaving their home, heading for a new life amongst the stars. The second half of the 23rd century saw the balance of power seesaw back and forth between the Expansionists and the Liberals, with neither side able to secure a majority for more than 2 years. Such pointless bickering served only to increase political apathy among the population, who did not feel in any way represented by Parliament. Voting in local elections made no difference, as the heads of state either didn't care or were powerless to oppose the almighty Alliance World Parliament. Of the various institutions that had been tarnished by the failures of the Outer Reaches Rebellion, perhaps none had come off worse than the Alliance Global Militia. It had been largely neglected since the end of that conflict, neither party wishing to associate with the disgraced officers. At the same time, both sides feared the other taking control and staging a coup, so they continued to be generous when allocating funds, some would say bribes, to the AGM. Political factions did infiltrate the military, with a handful of units swearing personal loyalty to one party or the other. Around this time, an Alliance Navy officer, James McKenna, was making his way up through the ranks. Despite his aptitude, his rebellious nature stymied advancement during his youth, but by 2295, he achieved the rank of Fleet Admiral and was given overall command of the Navy. Up till then, this branch served as little more than a glorified taxi service for the colonial marines, but James had grand ambitions for it. McKenna was something of a visionary. He secretly harbored aspirations to restore Terran control over the colonies. Rather than line his own pockets with a constant stream of money flowing in from Geneva, he used it to reinvigorate his tired personnel and beat them back into a competent fighting force. The centerpiece of his reforms was to be a new class of weapon. Advancements in Kearney Fushida drives allowed for new compact cores that would free up tonnage to mount more powerful thrusters, thicker armor, and larger caliber cannons than anything that had come before. 400 years earlier, a similar revolution in design among blue water navies had birthed HMS Dreadnought, a vessel so awesome that it rendered every other design in service obsolete. Inspired by this story, James adorned his pet project with the same name. Since the completion of Project Aphrodite, the industry that had sprung up around Titan had wasted away. Seeking a new source of revenue, they had begun converting their factories into naval production hubs. Their position just at the edge of the safe jump distance from Sol meant it was fairly safe to navigate to, bringing a vessel in close to the shipyards. With components coming from Venus, Terra, and Mars, the first true battleship began to take form. In the year 2300, TAS Dreadnought entered service. McKenna's new flagship massed an astonishing 960,000 tons, carried a crew of over 1,000, and was armed with an array of enormous naval autocannons. What's more, this was only the first of 7 such vessels the Fleet Admiral had ordered. While this activity did raise a few eyebrows, the Terran Alliance humoured James by supporting the construction of these expensive boondoggles, never believing that any other planet could field a weapon that would necessitate such overkill. McKenna was not done yet though. In 2305, Dytron Heavy Industries was commissioned to build 20 Dark-class light cruisers, adding to the growing fleet over the next decade. The Alliance World Parliament was entirely dysfunctional by the dawn of the 24th century. Since 2296, neither party had achieved sufficient seats in Parliament to win a majority. Various coalitions with smaller fringe groups were attempted between then and 2309, but these proved impossible to maintain, with none lasting more than a year. The Terran Alliance had come to resemble more of a black hole than a shining star, with the population of Earth trapped in a decaying orbit. Tension between the two main political parties had soared in recent years. Certain elements within them had begun to stockpile weapons in anticipation of armed conflict. Shady re-education camps had become an all-too-common sight. As it happened, the first sparks of violence occurred not on Earth, but across a handful of core worlds in 2312. This soon spread to the mother planet. Over the next 3 years, tens of thousands were executed for political crimes. As people became ever more fearful to travel, the second exodus drew to a close in 2313. Over 500 new colonies had been established in under 7 decades. Mankind had by this point set foot on over 1,000 worlds. One ray of light threatened to break through the dark clouds that were forming. With the situation starting to boil over, the more moderate parliamentary representatives started to distance themselves from the established political heavyweights. The People's Independence Party surged in popularity back in 2310, shaking the populace from their malaise. With neither of the established groups close to winning a majority, it looked like the PIP would be the deciding factor in the next election. Unfortunately, the party leader, Grant Zolli, was only interested in earning money. He held off allying with either faction in the hopes that they would offer larger and larger bribes to secure his support. Zolli flip-flopped between the two, promising to form a coalition with the expansionists in August 2314, then going back on his word a month later, a decision that would soon come back to haunt him. On September 5th, he was found dead under suspicious circumstances. Robbed of their supposed champion, rioting broke out across the planet, and the Alliance Global Militia deployed to break up the disorder. The People's Independence Party further exacerbated the issue by carrying out reprisal killings. Martial law was declared in the aftermath. James McKenna, meanwhile, ordered all shore leaves cancelled and recalled his fleet back to Mars, where they began taking on stores, loading every weapon magazine to capacity. The ignition point came a few weeks later, on September 23rd. A Liberal Party splinter group had been protesting outside Parliament at Geneva. Despite calls for them to disband, they refused to do so. Fearing that their president was in danger, the expansionists called in their own loyal party troops, a move which the Liberals perceived as preparing for an attack. Gunfire broke out, plunging the capital into chaos. 1 week later, the leader of the Liberal Party's Zurich branch and his armed guards stormed the city's expansionist headquarters on September 30th, killing all within. The bitterness and hostility could no longer be contained. By year's end, the Terran Alliance civil war had spread to 6 continents. Fleet Admiral James McKenna finally intervened on June 2nd, 2315. As a demonstration of his navy's awesome destructive firepower, he ordered his ships to take up positions in orbit, then commence bombardment of Strandraloch near Scotland and another small island off the coast of Australia, erasing both from the map entirely. As the shockwaves, both literal and metaphorical, spread across the planet, McKenna began broadcasting on all channels worldwide. To the men and women of humanity's cradle, attention. This is Fleet Admiral James McKenna on board the warship Dreadnought. The destruction of the islands near Scotland and Australia was accomplished by the combined fleets of the Alliance Global Navy. I gave the order to open fire, and I am just as ready to give similar orders should anyone on Terra attempt to jam my message to its people. You have all been suffering through a bitter war. Many, mostly the innocent, have been injured or lost everything they own in the fighting. Even the fortunate few who have gone unscathed thus far must have some friend or loved one who has suffered. Terra has been a dark place these past few weeks, with little hope of getting brighter. I ask you now, what is the purpose of this suffering? Do you believe that this war is a true and honourable one that will make your lives any better? Do you honestly believe that if one side or the other wins, it will benefit you? It is my view that all of us have been duped by the lies and deceits of a few wily politicians. They have led you to believe that this war will somehow end your and the Alliance's problems once and for all. They lie. They struggle for personal power and not for your benefit. It is time for change. The government is corrupt and must go. We must bring back the voice of the people so that it may be heard. I propose the founding of a new government to replace the Alliance. A strong government responsive to its people, yet unburdened by the constant and useless elections. A strong government that will re-establish Terra as the proper center of humanity. Fellow humans, it is time that we cease to behave in the violent ways of Homo sapiens and begin to behave in the ways of Homo stellaris, men and women of the stars. Those who share this view need only lay down their weapons and return home to await further messages. Those who do not agree to change had best be warned. I intend to hunt every last one of you and feed you to the public that has been so abused. Most of the Alliance Global Militia had remained neutral during the fighting, which was largely limited to just the paramilitary forces of the expansionists and liberals. To those few units who had taken up arms in support of those corrupt politicians, McKenna gave a more terse warning. Attention all AGM members currently participating in the barbarities. Cease all hostile actions and return to your barracks, or I will bombard you into oblivion. He gave them 24 hours to stand down, after which he ordered his ships to open fire on their headquarters from orbit. For those who took shelter among the cities, he dispatched the loyal colonial marines to root them out. Both government factions attempted to fight back. On the ground, the Alliance army willingly threw their support behind McKenna, engaging the heaviest concentrations of political troops in the battles of Bangkok and Zurich. The AGM faced one of their greatest challenges in securing the ocean liner Prince Albert after government forces infiltrated the vessel. At the L4 Lagrange point, attacks against the fleet led to the Dreadnought-class TAS Wildcat and TAS Yalu colliding, causing considerable damage, but both weathered the storm. The largest battle took place at Geneva itself. The skies above the city played host to one of the largest dogfights in centuries. All three sides committed their Hurricane strike fighters to the three-way furball, with only strength in numbers winning the AGM a victory, but at heavy cost. People on the ground were just as unlucky. Most sought shelter to avoid the falling debris, but biochemical weapons were more insidious killers that claimed the lives of many thousands. With the main battles over, James set about uncovering the party leaders who had gone to ground. They had to contend with significant unrest among the populace, who had been living in fear for the past few decades, but the vast majority were firmly behind the Fleet Admiral, regardless of what form the new government he was promising them might take. He was even so kind to offer the survivors from the renegade AGM units a chance to redeem themselves, provided they accept a demotion for misconduct. Every member of the Alliance World Parliament was forced to resign. Any who declined were taken into custody. The last of the liberals were arrested in mid-July, with the final expansionist stronghold located in the Caribbean on the 22nd. When they refused to surrender, McKenna ordered their execution, bringing an end to the Terran Alliance civil war. On July 22nd, 2315, the same day the last of the fugitives were subdued, Fleet Admiral James McKenna issued a public proclamation from aboard TAS Dreadnought. He had remained in orbit throughout the conflict, looking down disapprovingly on the anarchy unfolding below. It was the first time since the AGM entered into the morass of fighting 7 weeks earlier that anyone had heard from him. His speech was to be one of the most important in history, as it would surely set the course of humanity for centuries to come. James began by lambasting the political parties for what they had turned the Terran Alliance into. What should have been a union of cooperation and equality had become an oppressive police state. The corrupt and vindictive heads of government had brought the nation to its knees in the pursuit of personal wealth and power. As McKenna saw it, the rot went too deep to save the institution. He thereby dissolved the Terran Alliance outright. For their crimes, 20 of the former party leaders were sentenced to death. The rest of the captive politicians were later released back into the public. For those individuals, prison was the best they could hope for, but mob justice often ruled. In the United States of America, the president and several senators were hanged from the roof of the White House. This anger was shared by billions across the planet. True or not, each country's leadership was perceived as going along with the authoritarian Alliance World Government for personal gain at the expense of their citizens. 2315 would be the final year of not just the Terran Alliance, but of the old nation-states as well. But a dissolution of the old order was not all that McKenna promised in his speech. Having dealt with the sordid past, he turned to the future. As he saw it, Earth was perfectly positioned to become the jewel at the center of human space, a cultural and technological marvel that the struggling colonies would welcome back into their lives if only given the opportunity. Conquest was not needed to reassert Terra's influence over the outer reaches, merely the offer of trade and mutual protection. The fulfillment of this dream could not be trusted to the politicians of old. Terra needed a fair but responsive government, free of all the vices and faults of the previous administration, with a single head of state chosen but not ruled by the people. His pronouncement would later become known as the Hegemony Charter. For that day, he declared the establishment of the Terran Hegemony, a new interstellar nation that would raise mankind to greater heights than any had yet imagined.